Dawn at Pearl Harbor, the great American naval base in Hawaii. On Sunday, the 7th of December, 1941, it broke peacefully over the United States Pacific Fleet. In peacetime, the fleet always observed Sunday as a holiday. It was a time to relax. Pearl Harbor was defenseless. Aircraft neatly parked wingtip to wingtip to protect them from saboteurs. The fleet's battleships were lashed together, their crews below decks. But another fleet was at sea. 200 miles north of Hawaii lay the 6 aircraft carriers of a Japanese strike force commanded by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. After 12 days at sea, Nagumo's carriers had reached the point from which they planned to launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor without a formal declaration of war. In the grey, pre-dawn light, the first wave of fighters and bombers was readied for takeoff. Their crews received a final briefing for an operation which had been planned in meticulous detail. The first wave of 183 bombers and fighter escorts took off at 6 a.m. As their engines roared into life, Admiral Nagumo, who had grave doubts about the wisdom of the operation, anxiously paced the bridge of his flagship, the carrier Akagi. In the next 15 minutes, and with the loss of only 1 aircraft, the first wave struggled off the pitching decks of the carriers. Within 45 minutes, the second wave of 132 bombers had been brought up on deck and launched. By 7 a.m., the whole force was heading for Pearl Harbor. Minutes later, the first wave was picked up by a U.S. Army mobile radar station on the northern tip of Oahu. But the naval duty officer at Pearl Harbor dismissed the operator's report as a flight of American bombers coming in from California. The radar station was shut down. At the naval base, it was just another leisurely Sunday. Then, at 7:55, the silence was shattered by the roar of the approaching Japanese torpedo planes, flying low across the harbor on their attack runs. Anxious faces looked skywards. What kind of a drill was this? Then bombs began to explode on the battleships and among the tightly packed aircraft at Wheeler Air Base. This was no drill. Within minutes, the first attack was over. More than 300 aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. There had been little or no resistance, as most of the ammunition for Pearl Harbor's anti-aircraft guns had been locked up in store. The brutal transition from peace to war left Pearl Harbor's defenders initially paralyzed. There was carnage on Battleship Row. West Virginia, hit by 6 torpedoes, settled into the mud. A bomb exploded in Arizona's forward magazine, capsizing her and trapping 1,000 men below decks. Oklahoma turned turtle. California, struck by bombs and torpedoes, was disabled. Maryland and Tennessee, protected from the torpedoes by Oklahoma and West Virginia, were hit by bombs. Burning debris from Arizona also started a series of fires on Tennessee. But the Japanese triumph was incomplete. The Pacific Fleet's 3 carriers were all on missions away from Pearl Harbor. As his aircraft returned, Nagumo's pilots begged him to launch a second strike against Pearl Harbor's intact dock and oil storage facilities. But fearful that the missing American aircraft carriers might be bearing down on him, the strike force commander ordered a withdrawal. His overall losses had been only 29 aircraft shot down or ditched while returning, but he had not finished the job. On the morning following the attack, US President Franklin Roosevelt drove to Congress. Speaking of a day of infamy, he urged an immediate response.
That the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Three days later, Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States, as did his ally, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. The British had declared war on Japan on the 8th of December. Their Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, saw these events as the turning point of the war. From the moment he had come to power in May 1940, Churchill had seen no way of winning the war against Hitler without, as he put it, getting the Americans in. The vast economic, industrial and military potential of the United States was now fully behind the Allies, in the Pacific and in Europe. Churchill believed that we have won the war. Later he wrote that on the night of the 8th of December, he went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful. But first, the British and Americans had to face defeat. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins. The Japanese were rampaging through the Pacific and the Far East. The Americans were driven into the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines, where they surrendered. In Malaya, the Japanese 25th Army raced down the peninsula towards the strategic prize of Singapore. Everywhere, resistance collapsed. Singapore fell on the 14th of February, 1942. Then the Japanese pursued the retreating British through Burma to the borders of India. In the north, they threatened the approaches to Alaska. In the south, they menaced Australia. In a 6-month Oriental blitzkrieg, they had carved out an empire which put even Hitler's conquests in the shade. Some historians have claimed that Roosevelt knew of the Japanese plans but let the attack go ahead so that America could enter the war. But was he a mere pawn in a deadly intelligence game that achieved the same result? The road to war in the Far East had begun in Geneva as far back as 1932, when the League of Nations demanded that the Japanese hand back to China the province of Manchuria, which they had conquered by force. The Japanese response was simple.
Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
Then her representatives walked out of the League of Nations. In 1937, open war broke out between Japan and China. By 1940, the Japanese had taken control of China's coastline and large tracts of the interior. It was not until September 1940 that President Roosevelt decided to halt the Japanese advance. He chose an economic weapon, an embargo on rubber and oil exports to Japan. The Japanese had no resources of their own. The embargo placed them in a tightening stranglehold. They were faced with a stark choice: humiliating retreat from their Chinese conquests, or the launching of an all-out war to seize the economic wealth of the Pacific and the Far East, which would make Japan self-sufficient. The Japanese chose war. While their diplomats continued negotiations in Washington with the American Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, their military chiefs were drawing up detailed plans for the conquest of vast areas of the Far East and Pacific. These were approved on the 3rd of November 1941. The architect of the plans was the brilliant Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the combined Japanese fleet. Paradoxically, Yamamoto admired America and was pessimistic about the ultimate outcome of a war with her. He told the Japanese Emperor Hirohito that he was confident of initial success, but could guarantee only 6 months of victory. The Americans were well aware of Japanese intentions, but not their precise plans. For by the end of September 1940, they had broken the Japanese diplomatic codes and were reading all messages. They were encoded on a machine not unlike the German Enigma. It had taken American codebreakers 2 years to unlock their secrets, working on 2 messages which were breakable because they contained predictable phrases. The Americans codenamed the diplomatic traffic Purple. They built 4 Purple machines, one of which they gave to the British. There was a problem with Purple. It was used only to transmit messages from the Japanese Foreign Office to its diplomats abroad. In the nature of things, such instructions do not contain war plans. As war approached, the messages sent in Purple were increasingly ominous. They aroused the suspicions of American and British eavesdroppers, but suspicion did not amount to proof. Another code was far more important than Purple: the Japanese naval code JN-25. This had also been cracked by the US Navy's codebreakers. But the head of the Navy's War Plans Division, Admiral Richmond K. Turner, was so determined to safeguard this secret that he was unwilling to share it even with his president. Roosevelt received only sporadic summaries of Purple and knew nothing of JN-25. Similarly, the chiefs of staff kept the Navy and Army commanders at Pearl Harbor completely in the dark. They knew no more about Purple and JN-25 than an ordinary seaman. This allowed a dangerous complacency to creep into their readiness to meet a sudden attack. Someone else who did know all about JN-25 was Winston Churchill. From the autumn of 1939, Japanese naval signals had been routinely intercepted and read by British and Australian codebreakers stationed in the Far East and at the Government Code and Cipher School outside London at Bletchley Park. At this point, the British did not share this information with the Americans. Churchill was not satisfied with the odd summary of JN-25 derived material. He insisted on a regular supply of raw JN-25 decrypts. This gave him a ringside seat at the unfolding drama which was to reach a climax at Pearl Harbor. It has often been said that two factors enabled the Japanese to achieve total surprise. First, they observed strict radio silence while the strike force assembled in Tankan Bay in the Kuril Islands off northeastern Japan. Second, the strike force approached Pearl Harbor inside one of the huge weather fronts which regularly sweep across the Pacific at warship speed. This technique, long practiced by the Japanese, concealed their fleet from the prying eyes of American air and sea reconnaissance. The weather front was real enough, but radio silence was not maintained. In the days leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, at least 20 messages sent by Admiral Yamamoto and encoded in JN-25 were intercepted by British listening stations in Hong Kong and Singapore, and the Americans in Hawaii and on the west coast of America. They can be seen today in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. By the 7th of November, accumulating intercepts of purple traffic had convinced the Americans that the 25th of November was a key date in Japanese negotiations, possibly the point of no return, after which they would be committed to war. On the 25th of November, British codebreakers decrypted a set of JN-25 instructions from Yamamoto telling the strike force to move out of Tankan Bay to its standing off position and complete refueling. The message prefixes showed that the force contained aircraft carriers. But where was it heading? If south, to link up with an attack on the Philippines or Malaya, it would be spotted by American and British air patrols. Or the strike force could be heading due east, where the only target of importance was Pearl Harbor, the destruction of which would require carriers. A further intercept of the 2nd of December gave the date of the attack. Yamamoto had radioed the strike force, "Climb Nitikiyama," on the 8th of December. As Mount Nitikiyama was the highest mountain in the Japanese Empire, it did not take a code-breaking genius to deduce that this signaled the day, which would be the 7th of December local time in Pearl Harbor. This was the only time this crucial information was sent by radio. By a process of deduction, the British codebreakers in the Far East concluded that the only target which fitted the strike force's length of voyage, its mid-ocean refueling and use of aircraft, was Pearl Harbor. An attack on Sunday, the 7th of December, would offer the greatest element of surprise. The information was sent back to London with a request to relay it to Washington. The information got no farther than Churchill. Had he informed Roosevelt of Yamamoto's messages of the 25th of November and the 2nd of December, it would have revealed that the British had been withholding information from their allies at precisely the moment when they needed them most. Had Roosevelt received the information and acted upon it, he would have had time to set a trap to destroy Nagumo's carriers or to turn them back. This might have delayed America's entry into a war which Churchill desperately wanted them to join. American action would also have alerted the Japanese to the fact that their codes had been broken. This would have been a disaster for the British in the Far East, where they were faced with the possibility of fighting the Japanese alone. By the evening of the 6th of December, Roosevelt knew that war was inevitable. A 13-part purple message decoded by the Americans left him in no doubt that the United States was on the brink of war. But he did not know where Japan would strike. Assuming that the codebreakers at Bletchley Park were as efficient as their American counterparts, Churchill would also have received a translation of the 13-part purple message, thanks to the purple machine handed over by the Americans. The message contained the Japanese ultimatum and was accompanied by instructions to deliver it, with a final 14th part to the American State Department at exactly 1 p.m. Washington time on the 7th of December. In London, it would be 6 p.m. By mid-afternoon on the 7th of December, still early morning in Washington, Churchill had all the clues. Everything pointed to a dawn attack somewhere in the Pacific. On the night of the 7th of December, Churchill entertained 2 men to dinner at Chequers, his official country house. They were John Wynant, the U.S. ambassador, and Averell Harriman, Roosevelt's special envoy. When they sat down, Pearl Harbor was already ablaze. Churchill's butler interrupted the dinner with the news that the BBC had just reported an attack on Pearl Harbor. To Wynant's astonishment, Churchill exclaimed, "We shall declare war on Japan," and marched into his office to telephone Roosevelt. Amazed that Churchill had accepted such stunning news from his butler without even bothering to contact Downing Street or the Foreign Office, Wynant told Churchill that he couldn't declare war on a radio announcement. But Churchill had known all along. On the phone, he assured Roosevelt that Britain's declaration of war would follow immediately. First and foremost, Churchill wanted American help in the fight against Hitler. This could not be guaranteed by war with Japan. Churchill could not have foreseen that Hitler would seal his own fate by immediately declaring war on the United States. Two months after Pearl Harbor, the British suffered one of the greatest military disasters in their history, when Singapore fell to the Japanese. Over 100,000 British and Commonwealth troops were taken prisoner. Churchill survived, but the commanders at Pearl Harbor, General Short and Admiral Kimmel, were made scapegoats for American unpreparedness. At the subsequent congressional hearings, Short protested at his treatment.
I appeared before the Pearl Harbor Board, but again was not permitted to hear the other witnesses, nor was given the privilege of cross-examination.
Kimmel told the hearings,
We needed one thing, which our own resources could not make available to us. That vital need was the information available in Washington from the intercepted dispatches, which told when and where Japan would probably strike. I did not get this information.
By the time Kimmel spoke out, the U.S. Navy, which had done so little with its JN-25 intercepts, had initiated a thoroughgoing cover-up. On Admiral Turner's orders, all evidence of the breaking of JN-25 before Pearl Harbor was removed. Today, the Arizona remains as a memorial to the men and women who died at Pearl Harbor. She is the resting place for 1,177 officers and men entombed below, when death came so suddenly on that sunny Sunday morning in 1941. A cloud of uncertainty hangs over the attack on Pearl Harbor. Almost certainly, Churchill was briefly in possession of information which pinpointed the time and place of the Japanese onslaught. And almost certainly, he chose to withhold this information from Roosevelt, who was also denied vital intelligence by his own service chiefs, fearful of leaks and alerting the Japanese. For Churchill to have revealed that the British had broken JN-25 would have compromised his codebreakers and also threatened the Prime Minister's strategy for survival, to get the Americans into the war at any cost. The immediate cost was defeat, but the ultimate prize for Roosevelt and for Churchill was victory over Germany and Japan.